Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I still remember the moment I packed my bags and walked out the door. My parents stood there, completely frozen, while my brother lounged on the couch without a care in the world. For years, they treated me like a maid while he lived like a king. But the day I finally had enough, their reaction was absolutely priceless. I was 10 years old the first time I truly understood what I was in my family, the help. It was the night of my brother Daniel's 8th birthday, and the house was buzzing with excitement. Mom had spent the whole day baking his favorite chocolate cake, and Dad had come home early from work, carrying a brand new gaming console wrapped in shiny blue paper. Balloons decorated the living room, and the dining table was covered with all of Daniel's favorite snacks. Friends and family filled the space, showering him with hugs and presents. And me? I was in the kitchen, washing dishes. It wasn't that I wasn't invited to the party. I was there, technically, but no one really saw me. I was the one refilling drinks, handing out plates, making sure there were enough napkins. I don't remember anyone asking if I wanted a slice of cake, but I do remember my mother pulling me aside and scolding me because I hadn't taken out the trash before the guests arrived. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my room, staring at my empty hands. No gifts, no hugs, no happy birthday, big sister. You helped make this day special. Just the sound of Daniel in the next room, excitedly setting up his new console while Mom and Dad doted on him. It was the first time I realized my place in the family wasn't as their daughter. It was as Daniel's maid. Growing up, it only got worse. My brother got everything he wanted. New clothes? Of course. The latest phone? Obviously. He barely had to ask before my parents handed it to him on a silver platter. Meanwhile, if I so much as mentioned needing a new pair of shoes because mine had literal holes in them, my mom would sigh and say, "We don't have money for that right now, sweetheart. Just wait a little longer." Funny how a little longer turned into months. But it wasn't just the gifts. It was everything. The way Daniel could leave his dirty dishes on the table, and I'd be the one scolded for not picking them up. The way I'd be up at dawn, scrubbing floors, while my brother snored in his warm, comfortable bed. A girl needs to learn responsibility, my mom would say, as if cleaning up after a boy who was 2 years younger than me was some kind of noble lesson in life. Meanwhile, Daniel could forget to do his homework, fail a test, or throw a tantrum, and my dad would just chuckle. "Boys will be boys," he'd say. "Don't be too hard on him. He's just a kid. I was just a kid too." But no one seemed to care. One time, when I was 15, I won a school writing competition. It wasn't just a small thing either. My story was published in the district newsletter, and my teacher even called my parents to tell them how proud they should be. I was so excited. I ran home, practically bursting at the seams, waving the printed article in my hands. "Mom, Dad, look, my story got published." My dad barely glanced up from his newspaper. "That's nice, honey." Mom, meanwhile, was too busy yelling at Daniel to put his shoes on because they were running late for his soccer practice. I stood there, holding that paper like an idiot, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. But all I got was, "Can you start dinner while we're gone? There's chicken in the fridge." That was it. That was all I got for something that meant everything to me. For a long time, I thought maybe if I just worked harder, they'd finally see me. If I kept my grades up, if I did everything they asked, if I was the perfect daughter, maybe then I'd matter. But it didn't matter how hard I worked. My straight as were expected. My achievements were brushed aside. My birthday? Forgotten. Daniel, on the other hand, could bring home a test with a B on it, and my dad would beam with pride. "Look at that. He's so smart." I'd stand there, holding back the words I wanted to say. I get straight A's. I've never gotten less than an A in my life. Does that not mean anything to you? But I already knew the answer. I wasn't Daniel. And in their eyes, that meant I wasn't worth celebrating. The older I got, the more I started to realize the pattern. My role in the family wasn't to be their daughter. It was to be their convenience. If they needed something done, I was the first person they turned to. If Daniel needed something, I was the one expected to make it happen. But when it came to my needs, my wants, my dreams, nothing. It hurt. It really hurt. But the worst part was knowing that no matter what I did, nothing was ever going to change. Because the truth was, I was never the priority. I was just the ghost in the house. The one who made everything function, but was never really seen. I woke up on my 18th birthday with a quiet sense of hope buried deep inside me, even though I knew better than to expect anything special. It was a habit I had never been able to break, this tiny, foolish hope that maybe this year would be different, that maybe my parents would remember I existed as something more than just a maid. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of my brother's video game blasting from his room, and told myself not to expect too much. I had learned by now that disappointment only hurt when you let yourself believe things could be different. I got up, pulled on some clothes, and stepped into the kitchen where my mom was already moving around, focused on whatever task she had assigned herself for the morning. She barely looked up as I entered, just pointed toward the counter where a pile of dirty dishes sat waiting. "Make sure you clean those before your dad gets home," she said, already preoccupied with something else. No good morning, no happy birthday, not even a glance in my direction before she moved on to whatever she deemed more important than me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, forcing myself to act as if it didn't bother me. I spent the next few hours cleaning like I always did, scrubbing floors, doing laundry, making sure everything in the house was exactly how my mother liked it. Daniel, meanwhile, woke up past noon, wandered into the kitchen, and immediately started whining about being hungry. Without hesitation, my mother dropped whatever she was doing to cook him breakfast, as if he were some kind of prince who needed to be waited on hand and foot. She didn't even ask if I had eaten yet, didn't even acknowledge the fact that I had been up for hours doing all the work that should have been shared. I watched as she placed a plate of pancakes in front of him, watched as he scrolled through his phone, barely mumbling a thanks before digging in. It was always like this. He got whatever he wanted without having to ask, and I was expected to just exist in the background, unnoticed, unappreciated. But today, of all days, I thought maybe things would be different. Maybe someone would acknowledge that I had spent 18 years in this house, that I had done everything I could to be a good daughter, that I deserved even the tiniest bit of attention. But as the day dragged on, I realized, yet again, that I had been stupid to think that way. By the time evening rolled around, I had already given up. I had spent the whole day waiting for something, anything, but it never came. No cake, no gifts, no words of acknowledgement. Just an endless list of chores, and the sound of my brother laughing in the next room while he played his stupid games. I told myself I wouldn't cry, that it wasn't worth getting upset over, that I should be used to this by now. But then I walked into the living room and saw it. A brand new gaming console, still in its box, sitting right in Daniel's lap. My dad was standing nearby, looking pleased with himself, while my mom smiled like this was some grand, important moment. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my stomach twisting into knots. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. "What's this for?" Daniel barely looked up from the box, grinning as he ran his hands over the plastic wrapping. "Dad got it for me," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I turned to my father, waiting for some kind of explanation, some justification, something to make this sting a little less. But all I got was a casual shrug. "Oh, your brother's been wanting this for a while," he said, his voice so nonchalant it made my skin crawl. "We figured he deserved it." It was like a slap to the face. I felt the air leave my lungs, my fingers curling in a fist at my sides. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand why. Daniel always got what he wanted while I got nothing. I wanted to ask them why they had never, not once, given me something just because they thought I deserved it. But before I could even open my mouth, my mom turned to me, her face completely indifferent. "The kitchen's a mess," she said, as if the past few seconds hadn't even happened. "Can you clean up before you go to bed?" That was it. No happy birthday. No, we got you something too. No acknowledgement that today was supposed to be special for me. Something inside me snapped. I felt it break, sharp and sudden, like a glass shattering against the floor. For the first time in my life, I didn't say, "Okay," and do as I was told. I didn't swallow the hurt and pretend it didn't matter. Instead, I turned around, walked out of the room, and shut myself in my bedroom without another word. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, my hands shaking with anger. I thought about every single time I had put their needs before mine, every moment I had worked myself to exhaustion just to make their lives easier. I thought about all the birthdays I had spent waiting for something that never came. And I realized with absolute clarity that I had wasted 18 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it to me. I wasn't their daughter. I was their maid, and I was done. That night, after shutting my bedroom door behind me, I sat on my bed and stared at the wall, my hands clenched into fists as a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled deep in my chest. I had spent my entire life obeying every single command without hesitation, doing whatever I could to keep the house in order, making sure everything ran smoothly without expecting anything in return. But now, sitting there in the silence of my room, I finally understood something I had been too blind to see before. They didn't appreciate me, they didn't care about me, and they didn't even see me as an equal member of the family. I wasn't their daughter. I was their unpaid housekeeper, their convenience, the person who made their lives easier without ever getting a single thank you. And I was tired of it. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, and I didn't march back into the living room demanding an explanation for why they had ignored my birthday yet again. I simply made a decision in that moment that I was done being used, done being overlooked, done giving everything to a family that had never once given anything back. If they wanted a maid, they could hire one, but I was officially retired from the role they had forced me into since childhood. For the first time in my life, I refused to lift a finger. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my mom moving around in the kitchen, expecting breakfast to magically appear on the table like it always did. But I didn't get up. I didn't drag myself out of bed before sunrise to cook, clean, or make sure Daniel's clothes were folded neatly in his drawers. I stayed right where I was, staring at the ceiling, feeling a sense of quiet rebellion bubbling inside me. At first, they didn't even notice. My mom assumed I was still asleep, and my dad didn't think twice about the fact that the house wasn't spotless by the time he came downstairs. But by the afternoon, I could already hear the frustration starting to creep into my mother's voice as she grumbled about the dishes piling up in the sink and the unmade beds. She muttered something about how I was in a bad mood, how I'd get over it soon enough, how I'd eventually come to my senses and start cleaning like I was supposed to. But I didn't. By the second day, my mom's tone had shifted from mild annoyance to full-blown irritation. She stormed into my room without knocking, arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring down at me like I was some kind of unruly child who needed to be scolded. "Why is the laundry still sitting in the basket?" she demanded, her voice sharp, her eyes narrowing as if she couldn't believe I had the audacity to let the house fall into chaos. "The dishes are piling up, the floors haven't been swept, and this place looks like a disaster. What is wrong with you?" I didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't rush to fix everything like I normally would. Instead, I just met her gaze calmly and shrugged my shoulders, my voice completely even as I said, "Not my problem." For a moment, she just stood there, completely thrown off by my response, as if it had never even occurred to her that I was capable of saying no. She opened her mouth to argue, then shut it again, clearly expecting me to break at any second, to crack under the pressure and go back to being the obedient, invisible daughter she had molded me into. But I didn't crack. Daniel was the next one to notice that something was wrong. He had always been the kind of person who expected things to be done for him, who never even considered the possibility that someone else had been making his life easier. So when he went to his dresser looking for a fresh pair of socks and found nothing but an empty drawer, he actually had the nerve to march into my room like I was the one who had failed him. "Where are my clothes?" he asked, frowning as if the very idea of washing his own laundry was a foreign concept. I didn't even bother looking up from my book. "I don't know," I said casually, flipping a page without the slightest bit of concern. "Not my problem." Daniel blinked at me, completely taken aback, as if he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. "What do you mean, not your problem?" he asked, his voice growing more incredulous by the second. "You always do the laundry." I finally looked up, meeting his confused stare with an expression of pure indifference. "Yeah, well, not anymore," I said simply before turning back to my book, dismissing him entirely. He stood there for a few seconds, waiting for me to change my mind, waiting for me to laugh and tell him I was joking, waiting for me to get up and do what I was supposed to do. But when it became clear that I wasn't going to budge, he stomped out of the room, muttering about how unfair it was, about how I was being selfish, about how he was the one suffering just because I was in a bad mood. By the third day, the entire house was falling apart. My dad came home from work and immediately started complaining about how the place looked like a wreck, how nothing was where it was supposed to be, how dinner wasn't ready when he walked through the door. My mom, overwhelmed and irritated, lashed out at both Daniel and me, demanding to know why I wasn't taking care of things like I always did. I didn't respond, didn't engage, didn't waste my breath trying to explain something they would never understand. I simply leaned against the counter, watching as they scrambled to figure out how to do the most basic household tasks. Watching as my mother frantically scrubbed at a stain on the counter while my father fumbled through the fridge, trying to put together a meal for the first time in years. Daniel, meanwhile, sat on the couch, sulking like a child who had just been told he wasn't special anymore. And I felt free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one keeping everything together, wasn't the one running around, making sure everyone else was comfortable while I was treated like an afterthought. And the best part? They had absolutely no idea what to do without me. It was almost funny to watch them struggle, to watch my mother pace around the house in frustration, To see my father's confused expression as he tried to figure out how the washing machine worked. To hear Daniel whining about how everything sucked now that I wasn't catering to his every need. But the real satisfaction came when I realized something even more important than their suffering. They needed me. And for the first time ever, they were going to have to figure out what life looked like without me. The realization that my family needed me far more than I needed them settled deep in my chest like a heavy weight. One that slowly transformed into something sharp and determined as the days passed. I had spent my entire life trapped in a cycle of endless work, being used as a convenience without a single word of thanks. But now I saw everything clearly. They didn't just take me for granted. They truly believed I existed for their benefit, as if I had no purpose outside of serving them. And that was when I made the decision that had been lingering in the back of my mind for years. I was getting out, and this time, nothing was going to stop me. I had always assumed that leaving wasn't an option, that I was stuck in that house for the foreseeable future, that no matter how miserable I was, I had no real choice but to endure it. But after seeing how quickly everything in the house fell apart the moment I stopped taking care of it, I realized that the only thing truly keeping me there was them. They had never once encouraged me to think about my own future, never asked me about my dreams or ambitions, never supported me in making plans outside of the house. But I wasn't going to let them keep me trapped any longer, and so I started preparing in secret, making sure that when the time came, I would be ready to walk away without hesitation. For weeks, I saved every penny I could get my hands on, picking up odd jobs whenever possible, stashing away birthday money from distant relatives, and even selling old clothes online just to build up a little bit of financial security. I knew my parents would never give me a dime to leave, and I wasn't going to ask them for anything. I had no interest in hearing another excuse about how there wasn't enough money when I knew full well that they had no problem spending hundreds of dollars on whatever Daniel wanted. Every time I tucked away another few dollars, I felt a little bit closer to freedom, a little bit stronger in my conviction, a little more certain that I was doing the right thing. I had never truly considered where I would go, but as soon as I made the decision to leave, I reached out to my friend Natalie, who had been trying to convince me to move in with her for months. She had an extra room in her apartment, one that she had initially planned to rent out to a stranger, but when I told her my situation, she didn't hesitate to offer it to me instead. It wasn't a huge place, and the rent wouldn't be cheap, but it was a fresh start, something I had never had before, something that felt almost impossible but finally within my reach. The day I graduated from high school, I knew it was time. There was nothing tying me to that house anymore, nothing keeping me from walking away, except my own fear of the unknown. But I had spent my entire life afraid of upsetting my parents, afraid of disappointing them, afraid of what would happen if I ever put myself first. I refused to let that fear control me anymore. And so, I packed my bags in silence, stacking them neatly in the corner of my room, waiting for the right moment to make my move. That moment came during dinner, when we were all sitting around the table, pretending like we were a normal family, pretending like things hadn't been tense ever since I stopped playing my role as the unpaid housekeeper. My mother had been more irritable than usual, muttering complaints about the state of the house under her breath, while my father seemed to be in complete denial, acting as if nothing had changed. Daniel, as always, was too absorbed in his phone to notice anything outside of his own little world. I let them sit in their ignorance for one final moment before I reached into my pocket, pulled out my house key, and set it down on the table with a quiet clink. "I'm moving out," I said, my voice calm and steady, my heart hammering in my chest as I braced myself for their reaction. The sound of my mother's fork clattering against her plate was the first thing I registered, followed closely by the way my father's expression darkened as he turned to look at me. For a moment, no one spoke, the air thick with shock and disbelief, as if they had genuinely never considered the possibility that I might one day decide to leave. "What are you talking about?" my mother demanded, her voice sharp and incredulous, her eyes wide with something that almost resembled panic. "You live here." I felt a small, bitter smile tug at the corners of my lips as I met her gaze, knowing exactly what she meant, knowing that she wasn't just talking about the physical space of the house. What she really meant was you belong here, in this role, as the person who takes care of everything for us. She couldn't comprehend the idea that I might have dreams, that I might want something more, that I might not be willing to dedicate my entire existence to making their lives easier. "Not anymore," I said simply, my voice unwavering, my decision final. My father scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just said something ridiculous, as if my words were nothing more than a childish outburst that would fade by morning. "And where exactly do you think you're going?" he asked, his tone condescending, his disbelief so palpable it almost made me laugh. "You don't have a job. You don't have money, and you sure as hell don't have a plan. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before I spoke, making sure that every word I said was clear and deliberate. I've been saving up for months, I told them, watching as my mother's face twisted with something close to betrayal, as if the very idea of me planning my own future behind her back was some kind of personal attack. I have a place to stay, I have a job lined up, and I don't need anything from you. Daniel finally looked up from his phone then, frowning as if the realization had just hit him that this wasn't a joke, that I was actually leaving, that things were about to change in a way he hadn't expected. Wait, so, who's going to do my laundry? He asked, his voice filled with genuine concern, as if that was the biggest issue at hand. I let out a breath of laughter, shaking my head in disbelief, because of course that was his first thought. Of course he wasn't worried about me, or about what this meant for our family. He was only thinking about how it would inconvenience him. I don't know, Daniel, I said, pushing back my chair and standing up, letting my words sink in as I picked up my bags. Not my problem. My mother was still frozen in place, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to argue but didn't know where to start, while my father just sat there, silent and unreadable for the first time in his life. There was no shouting, no dramatic attempt to stop me, no last-minute declarations of love or regret. They simply watched as I walked toward the door, as I stepped out of the house without looking back, as I finally, after 18 years of being overlooked, used, and unappreciated, chose myself for the very first time. For a moment, after I said I was leaving, the entire house fell into complete silence, as if my words had sucked the air out of the room and left nothing but confusion and disbelief behind. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression dark and unreadable, his fingers tightening around the fork in his hand, as if he was trying to ground himself in the reality of what I had just said. My mother, on the other hand, looked completely thrown, her eyes wide with something close to horror, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to argue but couldn't figure out where to start. It was as if the very idea of me walking away had never even crossed their minds, as if I was supposed to be tied to this house forever, destined to clean up after them until the end of time. My father was the first to recover from the shock, shaking his head as he let out a dismissive scoff, as if my words were nothing more than some overdramatic tantrum that he didn't need to take seriously. "Oh, stop being ridiculous," he said, rolling his eyes as if my decision to leave was just some childish act of rebellion that would pass in a few hours. "Where would you even go? You don't have anywhere else to stay, and you sure as hell don't have the money to support yourself." His tone was filled with that same smug certainty he always carried, that same unwavering belief that I couldn't possibly function without them, that same condescending attitude that made it clear he thought I was bluffing. But I wasn't bluffing, and he was about to find that out the hard way. Without a word, I turned away from the dinner table and walked straight toward the door where I had left my bags, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached down and picked them up without hesitation. I could feel their eyes on me, could hear the sharp intake of breath from my mother, could sense the shift in the atmosphere as the weight of what I was doing finally began to sink in for them. I wasn't making some empty threat. I wasn't throwing a fit just to get their attention. I was leaving. The realization must have hit my mother like a brick to the face, because the next thing I knew, she was on her feet, her chair scraping against the tile as she rushed toward me, her voice rising into something almost hysterical. "You can't just leave," she shrieked, her hands gesturing wildly, as if she could somehow wave away my decision with enough force. "Who's going to do the cleaning? The cooking? The laundry? You know your father and brother don't know how to do any of that. This house will fall apart without you." I turned to look at her then, really look at her, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as my mother, but as someone who had never truly seen me as anything other than the person who kept everything running smoothly. There was no concern in her voice for me, no questions about where I was going, no offers to help or to support my decision. She wasn't panicking because she was losing her daughter. She was panicking because she was losing the person who made her life easier. "That's not my problem," I said simply, shifting my bag higher on my shoulder as I took a step closer to the door. From behind me, I heard Daniel let out a loud, irritated sigh, as if my decision to leave was some massive inconvenience for him personally, as if he was the victim in all of this. "Wait, so, who's going to do my laundry?" he whined, his voice dripping with entitlement, his expression twisted in genuine confusion, as if the very idea of washing his own clothes had never once entered his mind. And that was it. That was the moment that shattered any last lingering illusion I had that my family saw me as anything other than a servant they didn't have to pay. My brother wasn't upset that I was leaving because he would miss me. My mother wasn't upset because she was worried about where I would go. My father wasn't upset because he thought I was making a bad decision. The only thing any of them cared about was the fact that for the first time ever, they would have to figure out how to take care of themselves. I didn't bother responding to Daniel's question. I didn't turn back when my mother called my name in desperation. I didn't stop when my father barked out my full name in that sharp, commanding tone he always used when he expected obedience. I just walked toward the door, grabbed my keys off the hook, and stepped outside without a second thought. The air outside was cool against my skin, the night sky stretching wide above me, the distant hum of cars on the street filling the silence left in the wake of my departure. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp air fill my lungs, feeling the tension in my chest start to unravel with each step I took away from that house. For years, I had dreamed about what this moment would feel like, had imagined walking away and finally choosing myself, had wondered if I would feel guilt or regret or hesitation. But now that it was finally happening, all I felt was free. Behind me, through the closed door, I could still hear my mother's frantic voice, my father's angry grumbling, Daniel's annoyed complaints about how this was going to affect him. They were panicking because, for the first time ever, they were going to have to deal with the mess they had created, with the house they had allowed to fall into chaos, with the responsibilities they had always expected me to handle without question. But that was their problem now, not mine. I stepped off the porch, my bag securely over my shoulder, my heart lighter than it had ever been before. And I never looked back. The first few days after I left, I kept expecting some kind of massive emotional breakdown, some moment of guilt or regret that would make me second-guess my decision, some overwhelming urge to turn back and fix everything like I had always done. But as I settled into my new life, I realized with a strange kind of relief that those feelings never came. There was no crushing guilt, no nagging voice in the back of my mind telling me to go back home, no sudden realization that I had made a mistake. Instead, there was only freedom, only the quiet, peaceful realization that for the first time in my life, I was living for me and not for the people who had used me for so long. At first, my parents seemed to think I was just going through some kind of rebellious phase, that I would come to my senses eventually and crawl back home, apologizing for my dramatic behavior and begging for things to go back to normal. My mother called constantly, leaving long, guilt-ridden voicemails about how family was supposed to stick together, about how I was hurting them by leaving, about how I was being selfish for thinking only about myself when they needed me. My father, predictably, took a different approach, sending short, passive-aggressive text messages about how I was abandoning my responsibilities, about how I was being ungrateful, about how I would eventually realize that I couldn't survive on my own. And Daniel, unsurprisingly, wasn't concerned about me in the slightest. His only messages consisted of complaints about how everything sucks now and how he couldn't believe I had left them to deal with all this mess. I ignored all of it. I got a job at a local cafe, working long shifts and coming home exhausted but satisfied in a way I had never experienced before. The pay wasn't great, and the work was demanding, but it was mine, my effort, my independence, my way of proving to myself that I didn't need my family to survive. I learned how to budget my money, how to buy groceries without worrying about someone complaining that I got the wrong brand, how to cook for myself without someone expecting me to make a meal for the entire household. The small apartment I shared with Natalie was nothing fancy, but it was a place where I could exist without feeling like a servant, where I could come home and just be without someone waiting to dump more responsibilities on me the second I walked through the door. At first, the quiet was strange, almost unsettling. After spending so many years in a house where I was constantly being ordered around, constantly being yelled at, constantly being reminded that I wasn't important. But after a while, I realized that the quiet was something I had been craving for longer than I even knew. There was no one screaming at me to wake up early and start cleaning, no one barking orders about laundry or dishes or vacuuming, no one making me feel like I was only useful when I was doing something for them. For the first time ever, I could just sit in my own space, drink a cup of tea without interruptions, watch a movie without someone demanding my attention, go to sleep without feeling like I hadn't done enough that day. And while I was thriving, my family was falling apart. The first real sign of their struggle came in the form of a text message from my mother, one that I read during a break at work and laughed so hard that my coworker had to ask me if I was okay. The message was simple, almost absurdly so, considering everything that had led up to this moment, considering the way she had treated me for years without hesitation. How do you get grease stains out of a pan? It was such a ridiculous thing for her to ask me, so baffling in its casual helplessness, that I actually had to read it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. After years of being treated like I was worthless, after years of being ignored and taken advantage of, after years of never being acknowledged as anything other than a maid, my mother was now sitting in that house, realizing, probably for the first time, that she had no idea how to take care of the home she had once expected me to maintain effortlessly. I didn't respond. I could only imagine the disaster unfolding back in my parents' house. The slow and steady unraveling of everything that I had once held together, the absolute chaos that had taken over in my absence. My mother, who had always barked orders but never lifted a finger, was now being forced to figure out how to cook and clean on her own, realizing that years of treating me like a housekeeper had left her completely incapable of managing her own household. My father, who had scoffed at the idea that I could leave, was probably sitting in the middle of a messy, disorganized home, wondering why no one was doing anything to fix it. And Daniel, my spoiled, entitled brother, was likely furious that his laundry wasn't magically folding itself, that his meals weren't appearing in front of him without effort, that the house wasn't spotless without anyone lifting a finger. I got more texts after that, each one confirming exactly what I already knew, that without me, the house was crumbling. My mother sent frustrated messages about how difficult it was to keep things clean, about how she never realized how much work went into maintaining a home, about how she wished I had prepared them better before leaving. My father, who had once acted like I was completely replaceable, now texted me about how he hoped I was doing well, as if suddenly pretending to care would somehow convince me to come back. And Daniel, of course, continued to complain, his messages alternating between whining about how unfair it was that I had left and demanding that I at least come home once a week to help clean up. I didn't answer any of them. They weren't reaching out because they missed me, because they wanted to fix things, because they had realized how terribly they had treated me. They were reaching out because they wanted things to go back to the way they had been before, because they wanted me to step in and save them from the mess they had created, because they didn't actually want to take responsibility for their own lives. But I wasn't their maid anymore. I had spent 18 years breaking my back for people who had never once appreciated me, had wasted my childhood waiting for love that would never come, had given up every moment of peace just to make their lives easier. And now, for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. So I ignored their messages, put my phone away, and went back to work with a smile on my face, knowing that I had finally given them exactly what they had always deserved, a life without me in it. It had been months since I left my parents' house behind, months of peace and quiet, months of learning how to live for myself, months of ignoring the desperate messages from my mother, the passive-aggressive texts from my father, and the whiny complaints from my brother about how everything sucked now that I was gone. I had expected them to eventually stop trying to reach out, to accept the fact that I wasn't coming back, to move on and figure out how to take care of themselves, but apparently that had been too much to hope for. Their messages had slowed down in frequency, but every now and then I would still get some variation of the same pathetic attempt to lure me back, always framed as if they were worried about me when I knew full well they were just struggling to maintain their own lives without someone constantly cleaning up after them. That's why, when I heard a knock on my apartment door one evening, I assumed it was Natalie coming back from work or maybe a package being delivered, something completely normal and expected. But when I pulled open the door and found myself staring straight at my younger brother, looking exhausted and absolutely miserable, I felt a mixture of shock and amusement settle in my chest. Daniel had never once made the effort to come see me since I left, had never reached out for anything other than to complain about how my absence was ruining his life, had never even acknowledged that I existed outside of what I could do for him. Yet there he was, standing in my doorway like some lost puppy, his hair unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, his entire posture slumped like the weight of the world had suddenly been dropped onto his shoulders. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there awkwardly, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his hoodie, his gaze flickering to the side, as if he was debating whether or not to actually go through with whatever he had come here to say. Finally, after a few seconds of heavy silence, he let out a small, defeated sigh and muttered, "Can I come in?" His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the usual entitlement, missing that arrogant confidence that he had always carried so effortlessly, and that alone was enough to pique my curiosity. I stepped aside without saying a word, letting him shuffle past me into the apartment, watching as he dropped down onto my couch like he had just run a marathon and was finally allowing himself to rest. He looked different than I remembered, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself, in the way his shoulders hunched forward slightly, in the way he rubbed a hand over his face as if he was barely holding himself together. I closed the door behind him and leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms as I studied him. waiting for him to explain why he had suddenly decided to show up at my door after months of radio silence. For a while, he just sat there, staring at the floor, his fingers tapping absently against his knee like he was trying to figure out where to start. Then, without looking up, he muttered, "Mom and Dad are a mess." His voice was flat, tired, lacking the usual smugness that had always driven me insane when we were growing up. They keep fighting all the time, like over stupid stuff, over things that don't even matter, and I don't know how to deal with it. He let out another deep sigh, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. The house is disgusting, like actually disgusting, worse than I ever thought it could get. Mom keeps freaking out because she doesn't know how to keep up with everything, and Dad just gets mad all the time because nothing is getting done. It's like everything is just falling apart without you there. There was something darkly satisfying about hearing him say those words out loud, something deeply vindicating about knowing that they were all finally experiencing even a fraction of what I had dealt with for my entire life. I had spent years holding everything together, making sure they never had to lift a finger, never had to experience stress, never had to feel overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility, and now that I was gone, they were completely incapable of functioning. It was almost funny, really, how quickly their perfect little world had collapsed the second I stopped cleaning up after them. For the first time in his life, Daniel was getting a taste of what it was like to be me, and I couldn't deny how satisfying it was to watch him squirm under the weight of it. "So what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow as I leaned back against the counter. "You came all the way over here just to tell me that things suck without me?" Daniel let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking his head as he rubbed his hands over his face. "I don't know," he admitted, exhaling sharply. I don't know what to do. It's just different now." He paused for a second, then finally lifted his gaze to meet mine. And for the first time ever, I saw something that almost resembled guilt flicker across his expression. "I don't think I ever really understood how much you did for us until you weren't there to do it anymore." I blinked at him, caught off guard by his words, by the honesty in his tone, by the fact that he was actually acknowledging what I had been through instead of brushing it off like it was nothing. It wasn't quite an apology, not yet, but it was something I had never expected to hear from him. I tilted my head slightly, studying him for a moment before asking, "So what do you want me to do about it?" Daniel let out another sigh, slumping further into the couch, his hands resting on his knees as he stared at the floor. "Nothing," he said after a long pause. "I don't know. I guess I just wanted to talk to someone who gets it." That was what surprised me the most. Not that he was struggling, not that he was finally realizing how much I had done, but that he had actually come to me instead of trying to pretend like everything was fine. For the first time in his life, Daniel had been forced to face the reality of what I had gone through. And for the first time, he wasn't dismissing it. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't acting like it was all in my head. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Wasn't sure if I even wanted to say anything at all. But for the first time in a long time, I saw my brother not as the spoiled golden child who had everything handed to him, but as a person who was finally starting to see the truth. And honestly, it was kind of satisfying. Daniel sat on my couch, staring down at his hands, his fingers tapping against his knee like he was trying to find the right words, as if he wasn't sure how to say what he had really come here to say. There was an awkwardness between us that had never been there before, a strange, unfamiliar weight in the air, something that made it clear he wasn't just here to complain, that he wasn't just here to tell me how miserable life had been without me. No, this was different, and for the first time I could see something real in his expression, something that almost looked like uncertainty, like regret, like the realization of a truth he had spent years ignoring. Finally, after a long pause, he exhaled deeply and ran a hand through his already messy hair, looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him before. "Look," he started, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the usual cocky edge, missing that usual tone of entitlement that I had grown so used to hearing from him. "I know you're probably not going to want to hear this, but I think you should come back home. Mom and Dad." I didn't even let him finish the sentence before I let out a short, humorless laugh and shook my head, already knowing exactly where this conversation was going. "No," I said simply, not even hesitating, not even giving him the chance to explain whatever ridiculous justification he was about to throw at me. "I'm not coming back, Daniel. There's nothing for me there." He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly as if he had expected that answer, as if he already knew what I was going to say before I even said it. But he still wasn't ready to give up just yet. "I get why you left," he admitted, his tone softer now, more serious, more thoughtful than I had ever heard it before. "I do okay? I didn't at first, but now I get it." He let out another deep breath, rubbing a hand over his face before finally lifting his gaze to meet mine. "But they need you." They listen to you. They're a mess without you there. There it was. I almost laughed again, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable, because it was exactly what I had expected, because even now, even after everything, they still didn't see me as a person. They didn't want me back because they missed me, because they cared about me, because they realized how horribly they had treated me. They wanted me back because I made their lives easier, because without me, they had to actually deal with the consequences of their own laziness, their own entitlement, their own inability to function without someone catering to their every need. They don't need me, I said, my voice calm but firm, making sure he understood that there was no room for negotiation, no space for convincing, no chance that I was ever going to walk back into that house and resume the role they had forced onto me for years. They need a maid, and that's not me anymore. Daniel flinched slightly at my words, his expression twisting into something complicated, something that almost looked like guilt but not quite, something that told me he knew I was right but didn't want to admit it. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just sat there with his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the edge of his hoodie like he was trying to hold on to whatever argument he had been preparing before he got here. But in the end, he didn't fight me on it, didn't try to push the issue, didn't try to convince me that I was wrong. Instead, he let out another slow breath and finally said something I never thought I would hear from him. "I never realized how much you did," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, like the words were foreign to him, like they tasted strange in his mouth. "I thought things just happened. I thought the house just stayed clean because it was supposed to, that food just showed up on the table because that's how it worked, that everything just kind of took care of itself." He shook his head slightly, his brows furrowing like he was still trying to wrap his head around the concept of basic responsibility. "I guess I just never thought about it before." It wasn't an apology, not really, not in the way that I had always wanted, not in the way that would erase the years of frustration and exhaustion and loneliness that I had endured in that house. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall of denial that had surrounded him for years, a tiny moment of realization that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. And even though it wasn't enough to make up for everything, even though it didn't change the past, even though it didn't fix the damage that had already been done, it was still something I never thought I would get. For a long moment, I just looked at him, studying his face, trying to decide if he actually meant what he was saying or if this was just another attempt to manipulate me into coming back. But there was no smugness in his expression, no expectation, no attempt to guilt-trip me into fixing the mess he and my parents had created. He just looked tired. I let out a small breath, leaning back against the counter, my arms crossed as I considered my response. "Yeah, well," I said finally, my tone lighter than before but still firm, still unwavering. "Now you know." Daniel let out a small, bitter chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned back against the couch, his arms draped over the back of it as he stared up at the ceiling. "Yeah," he muttered almost to himself. "Now I know." We sat in silence for a while after that, neither of us really knowing what else to say, neither of us sure where to go from here. For so long, Daniel had been nothing but an extension of my parents, another person who used me without thinking, another person who benefited from my work without acknowledging it, another person who made me feel invisible in my own home. But now, for the first time ever, I saw something different in him, something that made me think that maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I'd ever get. And for once, I let myself enjoy it. The months that followed Daniel's unexpected visit were strangely peaceful, filled with a kind of quiet that I had never truly known before, a sense of freedom that still felt new and unfamiliar, but incredibly right in a way I couldn't quite put into words. I had spent so many years being weighed down by obligation, so many years waking up with a list of chores already forming in my head, so many years feeling like my life wasn't even mine to live, and now, for the first time, I was finally experiencing what it meant to exist without constantly catering to someone else's needs. No one was yelling for me to clean the kitchen before I even had the chance to eat breakfast. No one was demanding that I drop everything to fetch them something they were perfectly capable of getting themselves, and no one was making me feel like I was nothing more than a background character in my own life. But while I was moving forward, my parents refused to let go as easily as I had hoped they would, still clinging to the belief that I would eventually come crawling back, that I would realize I had made a mistake, that I would somehow miss being their unpaid servant and beg for things to go back to the way they had been before. At first, they called non-stop, filling my voicemail with long-winded messages about how I was being selfish, about how I had abandoned my family, about how they couldn't believe I would do this to them after everything they had done for me. My mother was the worst, her voice dripping with desperation as she tried to guilt-trip me into feeling bad, throwing around phrases like family sticks together and you'll regret this one day, as if they would somehow undo everything they had put me through. My father, on the other hand, took a different approach, his text shorter, colder, more focused on how disrespectful I was being, how I was throwing away my responsibilities, how I needed to grow up and come home before it was too late. I never responded. I read their messages, listened to their voicemails, let their words sit in my inbox like forgotten scraps of paper I had no intention of picking up, but I never once let myself fall into the trap of engaging with them. I had spent my entire life being controlled by their expectations, and I refused to give them even a second more of my time, refused to let them pull me back into a life where I was nothing more than an afterthought unless they needed something from me. Every time my phone rang, every time I saw their names flash across the screen, I reminded myself that I owed them nothing, that I had already given them more than they ever deserved, that I had spent 18 years bending over backward for a family that had never once done the same for me. Eventually, when they realized I wasn't going to break, when they finally understood that I wasn't going to fall for their manipulations, the call started to slow down, the messages became less frequent, the attempts to pull me back became weaker and more half-hearted. I could almost feel the moment they started to accept the reality of the situation, the moment they stopped pretending that this was some kind of temporary rebellion I would grow out of, the moment they finally saw that I was gone and that I wasn't coming back. I never heard the full details of what happened in that house after I left, but through the occasional word from distant relatives or mutual acquaintances, I started to piece together the truth of what my absence had done to them. My mother, completely unprepared for the reality of managing a household on her own, had spent the first few months spiraling into frustration, overwhelmed by the sudden burden of having to do the cleaning, the cooking, and all the things she had once dumped onto me without a second thought. My father, used to coming home to a spotless house and a hot meal, had apparently spent a great deal of time furious about the state of things, growing more irritable as he realized that things weren't magically fixing themselves the way they had when I was around. I heard through the grapevine that after months of struggling, they had finally broken down and hired a cleaning service, something they had always claimed was too expensive whenever I asked for the smallest thing for myself, something they had never even considered when I was the one scrubbing their floors and folding their laundry. The idea that they were now paying someone to do the work I had once done for free was more satisfying than I cared to admit, more validating than any apology they could have given me, more proof than I ever needed that they had never valued me, only the convenience of having me there to serve them. And Daniel? Well, he had finally learned to do his own laundry. It was almost funny when I heard about it, almost laughable in the most bitter way possible, knowing that it had taken this long for him to finally realize that clothes didn't magically wash themselves, that someone had been doing all the work for him his entire life, that he was just as helpless as our parents when it came to functioning without me. A small part of me wondered how he had taken it, if he had angrily thrown his clothes into the washer the first time, if he had grumbled under his breath about how unfair it was, if he had finally started to see, really see, just how much I had done for him over the years. I would never get the apology I deserved, never hear the words "I'm sorry for treating you like a maid," never receive any acknowledgement from my parents that they had been wrong, that they had hurt me, that they had driven me away with their selfishness. I had spent so many years wishing for it, longing for it, desperately hoping that one day they would look me in the eye and say that they were sorry, that they had been wrong, that they should have treated me better. But now, standing in my own apartment, living my own life, existing without their weight pressing down on me, I realized something I had never truly understood before. I didn't need it. Their suffering, their struggle, their slow realization that they had lost me forever. That was my closure. That was my justice. That was all the proof I needed that walking away had been the best thing I had ever done for myself. They had never valued me, had never appreciated me, had never seen me as anything more than a tool to be used. And now, for the first time in their lives, they were being forced to live without me. And I was free. I never called them back, never texted them first, never gave them the satisfaction of knowing whether or not I even cared about what had happened to them. Because the truth was I didn't. This was the final goodbye. The one they had never seen coming, the one they had never believed would actually happen, the one they had never prepared for because they had always assumed I would be there forever. But they had been wrong about a lot of things. And now, they were finally learning what it felt like to live without me. Looking back on everything that had happened, on every moment of exhaustion, frustration, and loneliness that had defined my childhood, I knew without a shred of doubt that walking away had been the hardest thing I had ever done. But it had also been the best decision I had ever made for myself. For years, I had convinced myself that I had to stay, that I couldn't leave, that somehow my responsibility to my family outweighed my own right to live a life that actually made me happy. But the truth had always been painfully simple, even if it had taken me far too long to accept it. I had never truly been a daughter to them, never been someone they valued for who I was, only for what I could do for them. And now, months after leaving, months after building a life that was mine and mine alone, I could finally see that I had wasted too many years trying to earn love from people who had never intended to give it to me in the first place. My life after leaving wasn't perfect, and I wasn't going to pretend that it had been easy to start over with nothing but a couple of bags and the money I had scraped together in secret. There had been nights when I lay awake, worrying about bills, stressing over work, wondering if I had really made the right choice, questioning whether or not I was capable of doing this on my own. But every single time I started to doubt myself, every time the thought of going back crept into my mind, I reminded myself of what my life had been before I left, reminded myself of every morning I had woken up already exhausted, of every meal I had cooked without so much as a thank you, of every time I had been pushed aside and ignored like I was nothing more than an afterthought. And that was all it took to remind me that I would rather struggle on my own than go back to a life where I was never truly seen. With time, I built something for myself, something that wasn't defined by my family's expectations, something that was entirely my own. I worked hard, picked up extra shifts when I needed to learn how to budget my money, and slowly but surely created a life that felt right in a way that nothing ever had before. I had my own space, my own independence, my own freedom, and for the first time in my life, I was living instead of just surviving. There was no one yelling for me to do chores the second I woke up, no one demanding my time and energy without a single word of appreciation, no one making me feel like I was only worth as much as what I could provide for them. I was my own person, separate from the role I had been forced into, separate from the weight of my family's expectations, separate from the suffocating burden of always putting everyone else before myself. And my parents? Well, they learned the hard way what happens when you take someone for granted for too long, when you push them to their breaking point, when you assume they will always be there no matter how badly you treat them. They had spent years relying on me without ever appreciating me, years assuming that I would never leave because I had always been there, always cleaning, always cooking, always fixing everything without complaint. And now, they were finally living with the consequences of their own actions, finally experiencing what life looked like when the person they had used for so long was no longer around to clean up their mess. I never once received an apology from them, never heard a single word of regret or remorse, never got any kind of acknowledgement that they had been wrong. But I didn't need an apology, didn't need them to say the words out loud, because their silence told me everything I needed to know. They weren't sorry for how they had treated me. They were just sorry that they had lost me, sorry that they no longer had someone to make their lives easier, sorry that their perfect system had collapsed the second I walked away. They weren't grieving the loss of a daughter. They were grieving the loss of the unpaid servant they had spent years exploiting. And honestly, that was all the closure I needed. As for Daniel, he changed a little, but not as much as I would have liked. We still talked occasionally, though it was nothing like the forced sibling relationship we had been shoved into when we were younger, nothing like the dynamic where he got everything and I got nothing. He had learned, at the very least, that life wasn't as easy as he had always believed, that things didn't just magically happen, that food didn't appear on the table without effort, that laundry didn't clean itself, that a house didn't stay spotless without someone putting in the work. He had been forced to grow up in ways he had never expected, forced to take responsibility for himself in ways he had never been prepared for, forced to finally acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, he had taken advantage of me just as much as our parents had. But even though he had changed, even though he had admitted things he never would have before, even though there were moments where I could see glimpses of genuine understanding in him, it wasn't enough to make me want to go back. I would never go back to that house, would never put myself in a position where I could be used again, would never allow them to pull me back into the role I had spent my entire childhood trying to escape from. I had worked too hard, fought too long, sacrificed too much to finally get out, and I wasn't about to throw it all away for a family that had never once fought for me. I walked away, and I never looked back. And honestly, it felt amazing.